which is right in the middle of the state. And an editor came over to me and said, hey, we got some reports of minor earthquake tremors up around Lake Sinclair. And Lake Sinclair was a lake north of there, but a large lake. And I thought, I'd lived in Georgia all my life. I thought that was very strange, like we had an earthquake. And it wasn't like the big earthquake we had here in the fall, where it's all up and down the East Coast. It was just a little minor localized tremors. And they said, well, why don't you call Sheriff Eugene Ressaw in Putnam County? And Sheriff Ressaw, you would probably, if you read it, you would say Ressaud, because it looked French, but Ressaw was how I pronounced it there. And call him. And he was like you might imagine, a character out of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or The Dukes of Hazzard or something. He was an old school Southern sheriff. And he didn't like newspaper reporters, and especially ones that asked him questions. But I called him up, and he took the call, and I told him, I said, I heard about earthquake tremors up that way. And he goes, oh, that wasn't no earthquake. That was just somebody dynamiting for catfish. I paused, and I think I wrote dynamiting for catfish in my notebook, and thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, is that legal? And he hung up on me. That was the end of it. That was the end of the interview. So, I was puzzled by this, but I kept making phone calls, and it turned out there actually were earthquakes there. Because it was a man-made lake built in 1953. This is an enormous lake, maybe 15, 20,000 acres. And it turned out Georgia Tech had seismograph equipment, and a scientist at Georgia Tech in Atlanta tracked it and measured it. And these earthquakes were caused by water seeping into the fissures of the earth where the lake had been built. And at that point, I sort of became fascinated that lake and all the lakes I'd grown up in, grown up around in Georgia, Lake Lanier, some really huge lakes were man-made. So I got really interested in the history. About some point about that time, I saw the movie and read the book Deliverance, which is sort of built around that. So I wanted to write, I knew I wanted to write something about that, and it took me a long time. So about maybe 8 years ago, I started working on this book. And I'm sorry to say it doesn't actually have dynamiting for catfish or an earthquake in it. So maybe that'll be the next one. And it takes place all in one day, so I'm going to just start out right here. Morning, Thursday, December 1st, 1955. This dog Percy is there when the dawn breaks, running beside the river and then turning away, through the woods and up the hill, leaves crushing under his feet, his path worn more than 10 years, stopping to smell the holes where the chipmunks burrow out of sight when he trots by. His fur is black and his paws black and even his tongue black, the blackest of all chows, but he is only half chow and half mutt like the backwoods country dogs that roam the woods around the old lady's home. His black eyes are steady and see the earth up close in the bridge between light and darkness and shrouded in a cool mist from the Ugasula. Drops of dew sparkle on the evergreens, and silvery and bluish reflections dance on the clear water gurgling on the banks and streaming in the middle, small white caps breaking in the slow bend of the river. He runs up through the woods, farther away from the smell of the cold river water, and through the lower hardwoods and into the pine thicket up the hill where the new shortleaf pines begin, growing every day, a few feet each year, their rough bark trunks shooting out of the red clay and yearning for the blue sky. He noses the fresh pine needles that cover the ground like a blanket before he crosses back into the hardwoods and digs in the old stumps, sniffing for the chipmunks down in their holes. He imagines their brown fur with a black stripe punctuated with white dots curled into a tight, dusty ball. He can smell the chipmunks clearly, can hear their pitched little grunts and squeals. He growls softly at them, his fangs showing. He runs on and smells the scent of rabbits and a possum in the big hole where the groundhog nest. He is on the lookout for squirrels, the flying one in particular, but they are nowhere to be seen. The old man had taught him when he was a pup to stay after the squirrels and to tree them and to bark and point up with his nose until he could come along with his shotgun. The old man had become more and more wrinkled until he was carried off in a box a long time ago and had missed a lot of squirrels Percy had scared up. Percy runs on, keeping his nose to the ground, but his eyes look up in case the squirrels appear along the break of blue sky between the pines and oaks and yellow poplars. The image of the flying squirrel coasting like a bird from tree limb to tree limb with his forepaws spread and his fur like a cape is etched in Percy's mind. He watches for the squirrel and dreams about him when he naps. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here in Percy's section And he continues to run around. He notices that like a lot of the cows are cleared out of their pastures. There aren't any deer hunters out this time of year where they usually are. And then he thinks about, you know, he's an older dog, he thinks about like snakes and the deer that he's chased in this area. And go to the end of his section, which is the first section in the book. He expects the old lady to come out into the woods with him like she does once a year about this time and cut down a red cedar and drag it back to the house and dress it up with ribbons and gold balls and then feed him ham. But lately all she's done is sit on the porch and gaze out across the woods, muttering to herself. It seems there'll be no decorated tree in the house this season, but he watches for her in the woods every day. He still misses the old man, pocket full of treats, rubbing Percy's belly until his back paws twitched, this way and that. He ends his route as he does every morning, with a traipse along about half a mile of river, backtracking his early run, eyes alert for beavers or water rats along the bank, and spying the water for a fish or turtle at which he could bark. He doesn't run as hard or bark as loud or growl as ferociously as he once did. After his run, he goes home and curls up under the porch and nestles there with his paws in the air and rubs his back on the ground and then drifts off into a nap. He kicks his legs in his sleep, dreaming of the flying squirrel and snakes and chasing the deer, the whitetails flashing as they splash into the river he has known all his life. I'm going to continue on to a new section here, but this is chronologically the next section. Elmer Blizzard gazed across the land he might be the last to ever see. He took a long drag on a cigarette and flipped the butt onto the ground and stamped it under his heel. Up the hill from the river in a clearing used for a cow pasture stood an ancient oak, its bare branches stretching high into the clear sky like they were reaching for something, hopeful even after 100 years of nothing, while waiting in the cresting field. Sherman himself had stopped for a smoke under that tree when the Yankees burned a swath through here 91 years ago. Wouldn't be that long till the lake would come and that old tree would be nothing but dead wood where catfish would gather if Georgia Power and the government's plan played out correctly. He reached in the back of his breeches and pulled out his .38 revolver and aimed at a bobtail squirrel in the neck of the tree, pulling back on the trigger and firing 3 times at the varmint. It shrieked and scurried down the trunk and across the ground. Elmer pulled the trigger a 4th time, but he'd used his last bullet, so the empty chamber clicked hollowly. He put the gun back in his breeches and scowled at the squirrel as it dashed away. He turned to take in the landscape. Down the slope, the river streamed through the gully, narrow but deeper in the cut of red clay between gently rolling hills. Pulpwooders had clear-cut all the pines where the lake would go, leaving only a field of stumps, but most of the hardwoods they left behind. Across the river and further up, sapling pines took over and stretched a long way back, the new trees courtesy of the Georgia Pacific Plywood Company. Lake must not be going that high over there, Elmer figured, and that'll be the shoreline. It was December, but the sun was warm and the brown grass rustled in the easy wind. The road where he parked curved down toward the Ugasula and ran parallel and close to the water for about 50 yards before it veered back the other direction in a lazy curve, a mirror image of the river's course. He ambled down to the water's edge where he stood in plain view of old Miss McNulty's house, the little shack across the road from the kudzu-covered junkyard, situated in a flat, low spot at the bend in the river. From about 100 yards away, he could see her, squatting on her porch by an antique bathtub, fooling with something under it, her back to him. She was a big-boned woman who carried herself proud, her posture like that of an old Indian chief, her hair dark despite her age. She'd been living in the house without electricity or running water as long as he could remember, that tub sitting out front the whole time. A black chow came hesitantly out from under the porch and stood next to her, his wide tongue hanging from his mouth. The dog looked at Elmer and then back at her. Elmer turned to face the river, unzipped his fly, pulled it out, and peed into the current. "Big water's coming," Elmer said. A long golden stream arched through the air and glittered in the sunlight before splashing in the water. "Yep," he continued, looking back at Miss McNulty's shack, not opening his lips very wide when he spoke. "The power company gonna flood you out, honey pie." He zipped up and spat, a little white gob floating on the surface like a water bug until it submerged in a riffle about 20 feet away. "Big water is sure enough coming." Then continue into the next section here. Miss McNulty didn't turn to look at Elmer until he was on the top step, the board creaking like it always did. He was a little man, wiry, 150 pounds at most, so it didn't squeak much. Wasn't any point in fixing it now, that old step, all those years of being loose. She'd let all those things go when Ralph died. Ralph never was a finisher anyhow. He'd been promising to do something about the bathtub he'd brought home and abandoned on the porch a generation ago. The tub was chipped and dirty, and it was packed full of rags and shoeboxes containing car parts, mainly door handles and hood ornaments. All the things Ralph had left behind. "Hey, Elmer," she said, regarding him cautiously but friendly. She'd heard stories and knew he wasn't a deputy anymore. "What you shooting at over there?" "Hey, Miss McNulty, oh, just an old squirrel. I figure I'd get him before he drowns." "My old dog here is scared to death of guns. Didn't you hear him whining?" Elmer looked at the dog sitting next to Miss McNulty. "No, ma'am, he looks all right to me. I know he's seen guns before." "But that don't mean he likes them." "Well, I'm sorry if I disturbed him." He glanced around her yard and then down toward the river. "What you still doing out here? They want everybody out today. Paper said you got to clear out by sunset." "Yeah, I know it." She was still squatting by the tub. "I'm just trying to figure out how I can get the feet off this thing." "You worried it's going to up and run away?" He spat off the porch and into one of the wild hydrangeas alongside Miss McNulty's steps. "Now that I'd like to see," she said. "Who knows what's going to happen when this water comes? This old tub just might try to run." She laughed, a hacking chuckle, and continued gesturing across the road to the vine-choked junkyard. "Man from the state said all these cars will make this part of the lake one of the best fishing spots in the whole mess. Something about the fish wanting somewheres to hide." "Yeah, I reckon they're right," Elmer said, turning to look at the leaf-covered old cars dating back to the beginning of automobiles. Model A's and T's and old trucks, a tractor here and there, a Stanley steamer, all rusting away. "How long ago did Mr. McNulty start hauling vehicles out here?" "It's been near 40 years, I guess." "Yeah, I wonder what he'd think of this. I guess this part of the lake will be 50 feet deep down here in the gully, and I bet the top of that old oak tree will be sticking up through the surface of the water. I wonder why they didn't cut it down like they did all those pines." "Ain't no telling," Elmer said. Miss McNulty put her hand on the tub and looked toward the river beyond the junkyard. "You think that dam is really going to fill up the land like they say it is?" Elmer spat again. Her hydrangeas were getting wet. "Oh, hell no," he said. "I don't think those damn fools know what they're doing." Elmer spat one more time. "You think it's going to take this big lake here?" "I don't know, Elmer, I don't know. First I heard about it a few years back, it didn't make a dadgum bit of sense to me. I thought they was all talk. Then last year they came around with a $500 check and court papers. Didn't give me no choice. It was then I started to believe. They say it's progress. I guess you can't stop it." "Shit," Elmer said, not caring if he cussed in front of her. He knew she'd heard uglier. All but 2 of her children, either in the prison or the crazy house, are dead or worse. Run off up north. And in my family, I'm the one that's run off up north. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little more for one last section. He helps her. They flip the tub over, and they find a screwdriver, and they get the feet off of it. It's a flathead screwdriver, not a Phillips screwdriver. Like part of the research of this, I don't ever want to write a book in 1955 or way back, just the details. You know, I had a Phillips screwdriver for a while, and it didn't seem right, and then the editor emailed me. We put like 12 hours into getting like half of a sentence right. So they do get the feet off the tub, and he ultimately, as you can probably tell, he's a little bit of a testy guy, and he gets a little restless, and he goes off and leave. He asks her, is somebody going to take care of you? Going to get you? And she says she doesn't really answer, and he assumes that one of her daughters will get her, and he goes off and leaves her there. So that sort of weighs on his mind. Next thing he does, he goes downtown, and this is the next section, and I'll read just like 2 more short pieces here. Elmer got to the Magnolia restaurant about the same time his uncle pulled up in his shiny police car. A big black Buick Century with white doors emblazoned with a star that announced Sheriff Lloyd Finley from 3 city blocks or a long bend and a country road away. Elmer didn't like to eat out in public with everyone in town stopping to speak to the sheriff and look down on their plates, but he'd been summoned by his uncle and had no choice. "Morning, Elmer." His uncle extended his thick hand for a shake, his grip warm and strong. Elmer clasped his hand and let go as quickly as he could. "Hey, Lloyd." "Son, it's always good to see you." Elmer didn't say anything, but he held the door for his Uncle Lloyd, his girth in the taupe uniform beneath the white sheriff's hat filling the doorway. He was glad not to get another lecture about his need for a stronger handshake. He stood behind as his uncle surveyed the magnolia, choosing a table in the back of the narrow, greasy spoon, full with smells of fried sausage and cigarettes. He led Elmer down the aisle between the booths and the counter. Warm steam from the pancake batter rose from the griddle and fogged the backsplash. Forks and knives on china and spoons tinkling in coffee cups slowed for a minute, as did the disorganized babble of voices, while everyone paused to see them pass. The sheriff nodded and spoke hello and morning to everyone, from the judge eating his waffle to the busboy with his dish rag. Elmer kept his eyes on the floor and spoke to no one, focusing instead on the black and white checkered pattern in the tile beneath his feet. He slid into the seat facing the back wall while the sheriff stood for a moment studying the tables and the counter, his expression a mix of smile, smirk, and scowl, ready for whoever confronted him, child or criminal or college professor. Lloyd took off his hat and eased himself into the booth as the waitress whisked by and dropped off menus and cups of coffee. Elmer dumped a load of sugar in his cup and stirred it with a teaspoon. He stared at the black coffee, and without looking up, he knew his uncle was staring him down. "Son, how you been?" "I'm fine, Lloyd, fine. How about you?" "I'll tell you what, I ain't never been so busy with all these folks coming into town. Ain't no telling how many." "Yeah, I've been seeing it in the paper. It's the biggest thing ever happened around here." Elmer said nothing. Lloyd took a sip of his coffee and set it down. They were quiet for a moment before Lloyd spoke. "Do you see that new Ford out there? That pink and white one? The new Crown Vic Skyliner?" "No," Elmer said. "You ought to take a look at it. Sharp as a tack. It's the governor's. First one like it I've seen." "Pink and white? Sounds like a little girl's car to me." "Nope, it's a cool ride. It has this green glass roof that lets the sun in." "That old man's a fool. He's just showing his ass with that car." "Aw, Elmer, it ain't like that. Aubrey just likes to have some fun, that's all." And they keep talking, and we learn a lot here. I'm going to sort of summarize for you that Elmer lost his job as a deputy from his Uncle Lloyd, who's the sheriff, for having an affair with a woman on the prison farm, an inmate, even after being warned a few times. So he's out of work after today with his job with the power company, and Lloyd's trying to help him, but he really doesn't want to. He doesn't want to let Lloyd help him or even help himself. We also learned Elmer's wife's been gone for about 5 years, and Lloyd wants to fix him up with someone, but Elmer's resisting that too. So I'm going to skip ahead. This is the last part I'm reading. They're still in the restaurant. Elmer then saw State Senator Aubrey Terrell walk in the front door. Terrell was tall and had a high silver shock of hair parted on the side above his dark horn-rimmed glasses. He wore a dark blue suit with a bright red tie. He started shaking hands with everyone, working his way through the tables and down the counter. He walked stiffly like he wore a truss. His voice was smooth and slow as he complimented the women on how good they looked and asked the men how they were doing, telling them he was glad to see them and they'd soon have a lake to go fishing and water skiing if they so desired, not to mention cheap electricity. Elmer turned back around and stared in the sugary bottom of his cup. The sheriff was watching Terrell work his way down the aisle. Elmer could hear the senator having a discussion with the judge 3 booths away, something about valuable lakefront lots. He lost track of his eavesdropping when the waitress set their plates and a cold butter dish on their table and refilled their coffees. Elmer cut a chunk of butter and slathered it on his grits, mashing it with his fork to melt it more quickly. The sheriff, who'd not taken his eyes off the state senator, slid from the booth and stood. "Governor, it's good to see you this morning." The sharp scent of aftershave preceded the senator, whom Elmer saw move into his peripheral vision and shake hands with his uncle in a vigorous hold. Elmer took a bite of grits. "Lloyd, how in the heck are you, boy? You keeping everybody straight?" "It ain't easy, but I'll die trying." "Boy, I know that." "That's a fine new car you got out there, Governor, mighty fine." "Well, it's an old man's indulgence, but it rides mighty sweet. I'll have to take you out for a ride in it sometime, Lloyd." "Any time, Governor, any time." Elmer cut a large piece of the biscuit and sausage and ran it through the thick gravy and put it in his mouth. His uncle turned his way. "Governor, you know my nephew here." Of course, of course. How you doing, Elmer?" Elmer put down his fork and turned in his seat and held out his hand to shake with the senator. "Yes, sir," he said. He said, speaking as best he could with his mouth full. "I'm doing fine." Lloyd said, "Elmer's been working for the power company. If you hear of any jobs, you let us know." Terrell tilted his head back and put his hand on his chin, moving his fingers as though he had a beard he was pulling. "Oh, that's right. I still think of Elmer as the deputy. Well, let me see. Come up front and see me this afternoon out at the dam. I'll introduce you around. There'll be a lot of folks down from Atlanta that could help you out." Elmer didn't say anything. He was half turned toward the senator, but his eyes were watching his food cool off, the little wafts of steam reducing by the second. Lloyd said, "Thank you, Governor. We'll do it. I'll be there. Elmer will get out there too, won't you, Elmer?" "Yes, sir," Elmer said, taking another bite of food but not looking his way. "Well, all righty then," Terrell said. "I'm going to let y'all get back to your breakfast before it gets cold. Good seeing you, Lloyd. Elmer?" Elmer half waved his left hand as he took a sip of coffee. The sheriff gave the senator another vigorous handshake and got a healthy backslap in return. "Thank you, Governor. We appreciate all you do for us." "I do the best I can." The state senator walked back to the front of the restaurant and sat in a booth with two lawyers who'd been waiting for him. The sheriff sat down and attacked his food, but the ham and biscuit in his mouth didn't quell his angry whisper. "God damn, Elmer, what's wrong with you, son? I can't do everything for you. You got to make an effort." Elmer scowled and leaned forward toward his uncle. "Why you call him Governor? Old Talmadge beat him like a stray dog." "Son, you know everybody around here calls him Governor." "Might as well call me Sheriff," Elmer said. And I think I'll stop there. So